Hello everyone, this is Professor Harper with another lecture for international reporting. I'd like to provide some context for the history of foreign reporting and international correspondence. I had the pleasure and possibilities of working overseas for almost a decade. I worked for Newsweek magazine in Beirut and covered the Middle East, mostly the Arab world. I then became the correspondent for ABC News in Cairo and covered the Middle East and some parts of Africa, mostly northern Africa, the Arab countries in the north, and then spent 5 years in Rome as a correspondent and producer and bureau chief for ABC News, where I covered Pope John Paul II, places in Europe, and also went back to the Middle East a lot to cover terrorism. It was a great experience and a wonderful opportunity. I worked at a time when there were many more bureaus and news operations for American publications in overseas countries, but opportunities still exist. What I wanted to do was to provide a background on the history and where international correspondents come from and what they do. And it's hard to kind of do the top of the pops because there have been so many great foreign reporters. This is mainly American reporters, and all of it started mainly with the Spanish-American War in 1898. Before that, there wasn't a great deal of interest on the part of the United States in international affairs, except for individual countries, Poland for the Polish, Italy for the Italians, etc. But the Spanish-American War thrust the United States into the world stage because Spanish interests in Cuba were defeated in that war, and it also gave the United States the Philippines, which became a key area for expanding trade into Asia. And there were two correspondents who, during this quote-unquote period of yellow journalism, who really were great reporters. Richard Harding Davis, his biography was called "The Emperor Who Would Be King," and from his hat and top coat and cane, you can kind of see that he was a dashing young man. As a correspondent, he covered all the wars of his day in the early 1900s and late 1800s, the Spanish-American War in Cuba, the Russian-Japanese War, and the Boer War in South Africa. His story about the execution of the Cuban rebel Rodriguez, the death of Rodriguez, is one of the most famous reports in American journalism. It talks about a young man, a Cuban rebel, who was being executed by the Spanish. And it was a first-person account by Davis because he was the only non-Cuban to see what was going on. And it was really an homage to Rodriguez for his bravery, not only while he was fighting, but also in his death. So if you have an opportunity, just look for the death of Rodriguez online. The other one was Stephen Crane, who actually had great fame, maybe a book that you read while you were in high school, for The Red Badge of Courage when he was only 24. It was a novel about the Civil War, and what was ironic is that Crane had never seen war when he wrote the book, when he was in 1895. And so he decided that he wanted to learn about war, and so he went to Greece to report on the Greek-Turkish War. And then he too went to cover the Spanish-American War in Cuba, first for the New York World, which was run by Joseph Pulitzer, and then for the New York Journal, which was run by William Randolph Hearst. And he wrote one of the great stories about war, which really had to do with survival. The ship that he was going on to Cuba it was sunk. He was one of the few survivors, and his story, The Open Boat, which was actually made into a movie later, is one of the enduring classics of survival. But he didn't survive for very long, unfortunately. He died of tuberculosis at the age of 29. Margaret Bourke-White was the most famous photographer of her time. She also was the most famous woman photographer in history. She worked for Time Life as its first female photographer. She was the first woman to gain access to the battlefield in World War II. Her photos in Soviet Union and of the Nazi concentration camps made her even more famous, as did her coverage of the Korean War. I'll warn you that the next photographs are pretty graphic, so just be aware these are from the concentration camps of life, those who were barely alive, and then those who died. In North Korea, someone's head was chopped off. A communist coming home to his mother. His mother thought that he had died, and she went on to chronicle a lot of stuff. But one of her most famous photos is of Mahatma Gandhi making his own cloth, and then a boy in a refugee camp when India was partitioned. Pakistan used to be part of India. India was non-Muslim, quote unquote, and Pakistan is almost entirely Muslim. So that the two countries were divided into two. John Hersey is arguably one of the most famous war correspondents. Not really for his stories on the battlefield, although he gleaned a lot for his book A Bell for Adano, which won the Pulitzer Prize. It was a novel in 1945. But his articles included one detailing the heroic deeds of John F. Kennedy on PT 109 during World War II. But his most famous is on the atomic bomb's effects on Hiroshima, and it's generally considered the finest piece of journalism in the 20th century. The article tells the story of 6 survivors, 2 doctors, 1 priest, and 3 other people, two women who actually survived, and through their eyes the story is told about how bad it was and what the effects were. The article took up the entire magazine, The New Yorker, on August 31st, 1946, and was later made into a book. Ernie Pyle is known for his human stories. He wrote about ordinary American soldiers during World War II for Scripps Howard, which was a newspaper syndicate. He won the Pulitzer Prize in 1944 for his accounts that were generally from a first-person perspective. Unfortunately, he was killed by the enemy fire during the Battle of Okinawa in Japan. Edward R. Murrow is one of the most famous, if not the most famous, broadcast journalist of the 20th century. He started out for CBS radio news, and he gained prominence for his live broadcasts from the rooftops of London. And he recruited a team to cover World War II, known as the Murrow Boys. One of those we see later, Walter Cronkite, who became the anchor of CBS television news. He then went on to produce a variety of important reports, one on a program called See It Now, which helped lead to the censure of Senator Joseph McCarthy. Fellow journalists consider Murrow one of journalism's greatest figures, noting his honesty and integrity in delivering the news. We move forward to Vietnam. Peter Arnett, who I know relatively well, he worked for the Associated Press when I was working for the AP, and also I knew him when he was with CNN and I was working for Newsweek in the Middle East. He's known for his reporting in Vietnam, where he won the Pulitzer Prize for his work at the Associated Press. He spent nearly 2 decades at CNN, most notably during the Gulf War, which was 1990-1991 in Iraq, when the United States invaded Iraq for the first time. He faced criticism because he was allowed to stay in Iraq while the rest of the Western reporters were expelled. And there was a censor looking over his shoulder all the time. And his argument is that he was telling the story of what was going on in Iraq, but he faced criticism because a lot of it turned out to be propaganda. Not necessarily his fault. He was telling it from one side, and sometimes that usually happens in war zones because you don't have the ability to go back and forth between the various sides. He wrote a very good book, Live from the Battlefield from Vietnam to Baghdad, 35 Years in the World's War Zones. And he notably was one of the few journalists who was able to interview Osama bin Laden before the 9/11 attacks. Seymour Hersh was an important journalist during Vietnam and continues to a certain extent today. When he was working for a small news service, he discovered the My Lai massacre, where a group of U.S. soldiers killed civilians in My Lai, Vietnam, and then the military tried to cover it up. And he received the Pulitzer Prize in 1970. He joined the New York Times, and he revealed the clandestine bombing of Cambodia. Cambodia was allies. They were allies with Vietnam during the war. Supplies would move from Cambodia to Vietnam, and there were secret bombings that occurred, and he published those and made them known. In 2004, he was the one who reported on the mistreatment of Iraqi detainees at Abu Ghraib prison. He's run into some kind of controversial stories recently. He accused the Obama administration of lying about the way that Osama bin Laden was killed. He disputed the claim that the Assad regime in Syria was using chemical weapons, and so Cy Hersh was always a controversial character, but now even more so. But he's certainly done some good reporting, particularly in Vietnam. Walter Cronkite, as I mentioned earlier, he worked for CBS Radio and then was one of the few who went into television immediately. He was known for his long tenure as the anchor of CBS News from 1962 to 1981. What is interesting here with respect to international reporting is that he supported the Vietnam War until the Tet Offensive in 1968. Tet is the national holiday in Vietnam. The North Vietnamese forces launched a massive attack, which actually failed miserably, but the North Vietnamese and their supporters in the South were able to get near the U.S. Embassy and bring the U.S. Embassy under attack. They moved into Hue, the second largest city in Vietnam, and created a lot of havoc. And so Cronkite decided to go see for himself what was going on in Saigon and Hue, which we now know as Ho Chi Minh City and Hue. And his negative reports saying that essentially America wasn't winning the war resulted in a significant change in the public view of the war. In fact, Lyndon Baines Johnson, the president of the time, allegedly said that if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost the country. And so LBJ decided not to run for a second term as president. Moving to pretty close to the present day, we have some great reporting that's been done in Iraq and Afghanistan. There are many reporters I could talk about here. I've only chosen three, but Sebastian Junger did a great documentary called Restrepo, which had to do with an outpost in Afghanistan where the soldiers were at the edge of the envelope. There have been a number of great reporters, but Marie Colvin was one of them. She was an American journalist who worked as the foreign correspondent for a British newspaper, the Sunday Times, the premier news organization of London for many years. She died while covering the siege of homes in Syria, and it's actually thought that the Syrians targeted her and using her satellite telephone transmission to hone in on her and kill her and others. Um, Marie specialized in the Middle East, but she also covered conflicts in Chechnya, the Muslim area of Russia, Kosovo, um, Zimbabwe in Africa, East Timor in Indonesia. Most notably, in 1999, she was credited with saving the lives of 1,500 women and children from a compound that was besieged by Indonesian-backed forces. By reporting over and over what was going on, the United Nations sent forces in there and was able to get these folks evacuated after 4 days. And she lost an eye during an attack around that time while she was covering the incidents in the war in Indonesia, and she wore an eye patch after that. Anthony Shadid, who was of Lebanese background, he was a foreign correspondent for the New York Times based in Baghdad and Beirut, who won the Pulitzer Prize twice in 2004 and 2011. Unfortunately, while he was going into Syria, actually was coming out of Syria, Tony had a serious asthma problem. He was also a smoker, and he had a fatal asthma attack, according to the Times, and his body was carried out of into Turkey from Syria by his photographer. What's interesting is that Shadid's family challenged the Times version of the death and was adamant that the New York Times was forcing him to go cover things that he really didn't need to go cover. Finally, Dexter Filkins also worked for the New York Times and now works for the New Yorker. He's, referred to as the premier combat journalist of his generation, and he really did great reporting on the ground with the soldiers, as you can see in the background. He was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in 2002 for his dispatches from Afghanistan, and won a Pulitzer for his work with the Times for his reports from Pakistan and Afghanistan as part of a team. He currently writes for the New Yorker and does some really good work about international affairs. That's a quick survey through some of the best journalists. I'm sure that there are some that you may know that I've forgotten to include, but just to give you a flavor of some of the best names of foreign correspondents who worked for United States publications from the Spanish-American War up until today. So thanks very much, and we'll see you on